Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today, we start a new quarter of lessons. Having finished our study of the Apostles and the book by Dr. Gene Getz, touching on who the apostles were. Today we start a new series of lessons. This lesson will look at selections from the book of Proverbs and then a couple of lessons from Song of Solomon. Proverbs is attributed to King Solomon, and I think rightly so. There's nobody who questions that. So who is Solomon? Solomon was the second son of King David and Bathsheba. Solomon ruled as king of Israel for 40 years. I'll give you some references, but we have so much material to cover. We want to go read each one. Look at 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42. King David himself served as king for 40 years. Solomon gained the reputation of being wise, and maybe even the wisest man who ever lived. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32, we read, "He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. Read other verses following that verse, talking about the knowledge and wisdom of Solomon. But there are problems with Solomon. And not with Proverbs, but with Solomon. One source of material I looked at to prepare for this lesson had some interesting commentary, and I want to use some of that. And so it's almost as we have two introductions to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs may best be understood in context with other wisdom writings of the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, Job, also Psalms, even Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. And so we need to understand certain terminology. These wisdom books often give short, simple, general terms of pithy statements that can be applications of how to live in a way that honors God and provides a successful way of living. Anyway, back to the commentary that I mentioned. It begins with, or it says, to fully understand Proverbs, it's important to define 4 key terms used throughout this book, and frankly used throughout much of the wisdom literature. These words are often used interchangeably in English, but in the book of Proverbs, they tend to have individual meanings. The 4 terms are learning, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. As I say, they're almost interchangeable in our English usage, but let's break them down because we will be using these terms throughout this quarter's study. Learning as used in Proverbs, is just the simple acquisition of information. Perhaps something we would learn in a short-term memory, such as obtaining somebody's phone number so we can call them back. That's the kind of learning that we are talking about when the word learning is used. We use that, what we've just learned, for a specific purpose, and when that purpose is over, then that information is forgotten. I don't remember the phone number that someone gave me so that I could call them back on a one-time basis, but I learned it. Another word is the word knowledge. So how does that apply, especially in the context of learning? Well, again, let's use the phone number example. If a phone number belongs to a close friend or to a spouse, for instance, and we call that number on a regular basis, we have moved that information from a short-term memory to a long-term memory. We use that information over and over. And so that's what Proverbs refers to as knowledge. That is information that is retained for later use or continued use. Then wisdom is the capacity for action produced because of knowledge. Remember, knowledge is information we have learned, but store it for continued or long-term use. And so wisdom is the capacity for us to act on that information. Solomon asked for wisdom so that he could govern God's people. Let's look at there are two references, and frankly, I forgot which one I want to use right now. Second Chronicles, chapter 1, verse 7. That night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered God, "You have shown great kindness to David my father and have made me king in his place. Now, Lord God, let your promise to my father David be confirmed, for you have made me king over a people who are as numerous as the dust of the earth." Verse 10, the important verse that in our study for this morning. "Give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may lead this people. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" So Solomon asked for wisdom. He asked for wisdom and knowledge, the information that he could retain for a long time use, and wisdom, the capacity to apply and act on that knowledge. Verse 11. 2 Chronicles chapter 1. God said to Solomon, "Since this is your heart's desire, and you have not asked for wealth, riches, or honor, nor for the death of your enemies, and since you have not asked for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people, over whom I have made you king, therefore wisdom and knowledge will be given you. And I will also give you wealth, riches, and honor, such as no king who was before you ever had, and none after you will have." In other words, God made Solomon the wisest man who ever lived on this earth. Finally, the fourth word, I said there were four. There may even be five in this definitional change. Learning, short-term use of information. Knowledge, for long-term use of that information. Wisdom, for the capacity to use it, such as the ability to make appropriate and take appropriate actions based upon the knowledge that we have of a situation. But there's a related or counter word, so to speak, and that is fool or foolishness. Unfortunately, Solomon, who God granted his wish and gave him wisdom and knowledge, such that he was the wisest man who ever lived, he didn't always choose to use that wisdom correctly. In his later life, he engaged in the opposite of wisdom, that is folly or foolishness. And so what is that? Foolishness is the inappropriate action founded in selfish and sinful desire. It is acting against wisdom rather than according to it. It's in many of the commentaries that I looked at and scholars' writings on Proverbs and Solomon, it's usually at this point that they point out, that is, in later life, Solomon wasn't acting with wisdom. They point out that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, they don't make the absolute statement that that proves he wasn't acting with wisdom, but you can take your own shot at what that indicates about Solomon's wisdom or failure or refusal to apply wisdom. The last word is understanding, and understanding is another key word because it is a part of what Proverbs is all about. Understanding is the complete knowledge of a subject with a responsibility to pass that knowledge along onto to someone else. Only after something is learned, retained, that's knowledge, and used wisely, there's wisdom, can it be taught to others. And so the book of Proverbs is the fullness of understanding with the responsibility to pass it along to others. And we will see in today's lesson that is what Solomon was doing. So passing along his knowledge, retained information that he had or others could act on in a proper way, that is wisdom. And so he is using that understanding to educate or instruct, in the instance referenced in chapter 1, his children. Well, let's look at Proverbs chapter 1, and we see verse 1 of chapter 1, the author or compiler is perhaps a better term, is identified. Chapter 1, verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. We read over there in chapter 4 of 1 Kings that Solomon had over 3,000 proverbs and over 1,000 songs or poems. Did he author all of these sayings? Well, first of all, we see in the book of Proverbs, which has 31 chapters, that there are at least two other authors or contributors named. Lemuel and Azer are the other two. It is suggested by many of the commentaries and many of the scholars who write about Proverbs that Solomon was the compiler of these different proverbs rather than the one who authored them. So this is a collection of practical life wisdom, given mostly in short, memorable statements. These other books of wisdom literature, Job and Psalms and Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, also called Song of Songs, Proverbs is a bit unique in its structure. It is a bit unique in its theology as well. It's concerned with practical life wisdom more than ideas about God and God's work of salvation. Now, Proverbs, at the time it would have been written or compiled by Solomon, wasn't the only wisdom book of similar nature. Other wisdom writings were found in Egypt. In fact, quite probably, Solomon has collected from some of those other works sayings and statements that make up a part of his Proverbs. So let's look at today's lesson. Our lesson looks at verses 7 through 19. Let's begin by reading verse 7, which is the foundation of all wisdom. Either Solomon or the author of this proverb writes, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline." The fool is the opposite of the one who acts with wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And remember, knowledge is the obtaining of information that is to be kept and used for long term. So, the book of Proverbs is focusing on the practical life wisdom more than theological ideas. Yet it is founded on the theological principle that the true knowledge, true wisdom, flow from the fear of the Lord. Now, it is not fear in the sense of terror or cowering in the corner from fear of being punished. This fear is the awe of respect for that which is worthy of our respect and our honor. And so it is the awe, the holding up of God as worthy of all respect and worship that is the beginning of knowledge, the acquisition of everything that leads to wisdom. And as I mentioned, Solomon points out that the opposite of that is someone who despises wisdom and instruction or discipline, says the New International. And I use an older version of the New International. So Solomon is pointing out the differences, and any of us who really aspire to be wise or act in wisdom with knowledge, we must start with a respect and an awe-inspiring view of God, our Lord himself. Then Solomon goes on to start his lessons, his instructions. Remember, you first learn something, and then you have knowledge, which is the retention of what you have learned, so that you can use it wisely, wisdom, and with the responsibility to pass that knowledge and wisdom, the way to use that knowledge, on to the next generation. And so we look at verses 8 and 9. And Solomon says, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They will be a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck." So what is a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck? It is the instruction of your father and the teaching of your mother. Solomon is talking to his children. He says, "My son." So some have suggested he's talking to a son. But with 700 wives and 300 concubines, over 40 years, he had more than just one son. The only son that is referenced by name in Scripture is Rehoboam, who succeeded Solomon as king. And one commentary said the only son mentioned by name is being Rehoboam. It's such a shame because Rehoboam was a fool. He was someone who despised, and remember the definition of fool, that's someone who despises wisdom and instruction. So he did not heed that which he was taught by his father Solomon. And thus he falls into the category of the fool that Solomon has written about. Verses 10 through 14, now Solomon begins to apply specific instances, perhaps gained from his own experience or experiences, and certainly what he has observed and therefore knowledge that he has acquired to his son. In verse 10 through 14 we read, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not give in to them. If they say, 'Come along with us, let's lie in wait for someone's blood. Let's waylay some harmless soul. Let's swallow them alive like the grave, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We will get all sorts of valuable things and fill our houses with plunder." So Solomon, speaking to his son or sons or children, and ultimately to all of us, says, be aware there are sinful people out there in the world, and do not let them entice you. Do not fall victim to what they seek to draw you into. At first blush, Solomon is saying it is important who you consort with, who you engage in activities with, who your acquaintances are. Judge them. By judging them, I mean make some decision ahead of time whether they are good people or bad people. And if they are bad people, stay away from them. And make your decisions before. He wants to educate and pass along his knowledge to his children. And so to all of us, he says, decide ahead of time that you will not join in with those who are sinners. What is the enticement that the sinner offers? One commentary called them gang members. And there's nothing wrong with an association of youth gang members. We generally associate with youth or younger groups, but in reality, that's not always true. But you can tell ahead of time if somebody is affiliated with a group who does bad things. And this particular group, Solomon is advising, stay away from those who are willing to prey upon innocent people, even to shed their blood, even to kill them. What for? Apparently for the excitement, the thrill of taking someone's life, taking their property, We will let's swallow them alive like the grave, and whole, like those who go down to the pit. We have no regard. We show our strength and our abilities. Come join us. Come join in with us. Why? Verse 13, we will get all sorts of valuable things and fill our houses with plunder. We'll get rich off of what we take from other people. Throw in your lot with us, verse 14, and we will share a common purse. We will divide it up among us. One commentary said, think about it. They're asking you to trust them. They're asking you to come join them and help them rob and plunder from innocent people. And somebody who would rob and plunder from someone else, you can trust them because they said they will share with you. Solomon implies that you need to be thoughtful and careful about that. Know who you're with and what kind of person they are, and make the decision ahead of time. Don't wait to the time to make the decision when they're outlining all these good things that they're going to get. Money, excitement, thrill, and you can have a part of it. I think back, it's not exactly the same scenario, but I think back to when my son was in the youth group and Lynn Pryor was our youth minister. That's many years ago. He taught the youth at that time, and my son learned a valuable lesson and applied it to his life. Dr. Pryor, Lynn Pryor, advised his youth to make a decision ahead of time in a dating situation how far they were going to go or not going to go. Don't wait until you're in the middle of the throes of passion to decide whether you will engage in premarital sex or not. You make that decision ahead of time. That is, in essence, although applied to a different scenario, that is, in essence, what Solomon is trying to teach his son. Then we see him going on in our final 4 verses to begin to apply that. Verse 15, my son, do not go along with them. Do not set foot on their paths, for their feet rush into sin, and they are swift to shed blood. How useless to spread a net in full view of all the birds. An interesting statement. These men lie in wait for their own blood. They waylay only themselves. Such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the lives of those who get it. Now, I work in the judicial system. Most of you who have been watching these lessons for quite a few years know that I was district attorney before I was judge. We have more cases that are criminal law cases that actually come to court than any other type of case. What comes in second and close second in our local judicial system are family law cases. And many of them have a lot of similarity. Solomon says to his son, he reiterates, do not get in with them. Do not put your feet on the same path. You're going down a trail with them if you do. And that trail will lead you into sin. It says, verse 16, for their feet rush into sin, and they are swift to shed blood. It's a wrong trail. It may seem exciting. It may seem like it will fill your pockets with money that you can use, but it's a problem. These men lie in wait for their own blood. They waylay only themselves. What is he trying to say? And I've skipped over that little phrase, verse 17. How useless to spread a net in full view of all the birds. Generally speaking, the idea is if you see what the problem is, if you see that it's something that's going to snare you, you will stay away from it. And if you see these people setting out their own traps, you should stay away from it. The birds do. They don't get caught up in the nets if they see the bird catcher spreading out his nets and then laying the trap, laying the food in it. Stay away. I'm trying to tell you ahead of time, Solomon says, because you'll be snared up in that net with them. That's going to be what happens. I can't tell you how many times I have seen the results of people engaging in criminal conduct and continuing to engage in criminal conduct, often thinking, oh, how good they are, how powerful they are. Nobody can do anything to them. But Solomon says, such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. What is the end? They get caught up in their own snare. And these are the people who end up going to the penitentiary. And they go there over and over. Don't go down that trail. Don't put your feet on the same path that they're going down. Solomon wants his son, and he wants us to decide ahead of time who we will follow. Will we fear the Lord, give our awe and respect and honor to God and his ways, or will we choose the foolish way and go down the trail with those who disrespect, disregard, and do not and despise God and his ways? You choose, Solomon essentially says, but he is imploring those who follow him to choose God and not the ones who despise or disregard God and go down the trail of sin. An interesting start, I think, to their study from Proverbs. Won't you continue to join us each Sunday morning as we continue to study from this great practical life instructions from the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon. Thank you for being with us this morning. Good morning.